Chanukah. Zos Chanukah is named so, although in more mystical and Hasidic Sfarim, it gives multiple explanations for why it's called Zos Chanukah. But this very simple reason is because the at the end of the Torah reading tomorrow, that we'll read on the very last day of Chanukah, it begins. It concludes with the words Zos Chanukasim Mizbeach. This, which there's a phonetic relationship between the word this and Zos. This and Zos are really come from the same word. But this and those, this and those, this is the dedication of the Mizbeach, of the altar, and so it was rededicated in the time of the Chashmonaim into the story of Chanukah. Just like in the Torah, when we read about the original dedication of the tabernacle, of the Mishkan, so we read about that on that day. Hence, since at the conclusion of the dedication of the tabernacle, which we've been reading about all the 8 days of Chanukah, we read at the conclusion of a Zos Chanukah Mizbeach. So is this is the dedication of the Mizbeach. So also is rededicated centuries later at the time of the story of Chanukah. So tonight is that final day. It is Zos Chanukah, and talk a little bit about Chanukah. Maybe we'll even talk a little bit about the parsha, but I'm not sure if the time will allow. There are, I'm going to want to talk about two questions that are raised, classic questions. The first I will mention is possibly the most famous question in all of rabbinic literature, and it's referred to as the Beis Yosef's Kasha, as the author of the Shulchan Aruch wrote a work called Beis Yosef before he wrote the Code of Jewish Law, the Shulchan Aruch. He first authored a super commentary to the work of Rabbi Yaakov Balaturim. Just a little history here, you should understand that the Shulchan Aruch, our Code of Jewish Law, which covers all of contemporary Jewish issues. When I say contemporary Jewish issues, I mean to exclude the issues that were only relevant in the times of the temple. Those, although let's say others like codifiers such as Rambam Maimonides do cover those laws, but the practical Jewish code of law does not cover them. They're not relevant today without a temple. Therefore, we only talk about the four primary categories. Now, those four primary categories, one having to do with the laws of marriage and divorce, one having to do with civil law, one having to do with the laws of kashrus and the like, another one having to do with the of daily laws, prayer, and holidays and Shabbos. Those four categories were first developed by Rabbi Yaakov Balaturim, Rabbi Yaakov, who's called the Balaturim, the owner, the master of the Turim. The Turim means the rows. He created 4 rows, just like on the Choshen, the breastplate that the Kohen Gadol wore. He had 4 rows of stones, so he made the 4 rows of Jewish law. And the author of the subsequent Shulchan Aruch, Code of Jewish Law, patterned himself after that. But he wrote first, before writing his Shulchan Aruch, the Code of Jewish Law, he wrote a super commentary on the work of the Balaturim, of Rabbi Yaakov Balaturim, which is called, we refer to as the Tur. He wrote that super commentary called the Beis Yosef, because his name was Rabbi Yosef Karo. Beis Yosef means the house of Yosef. As a matter of fact, the term Beis Yosef is first found in this week's Torah portion. Now we're getting back to the Torah portion. In this week's Torah portion, when the brothers are brought to Beis Yosef, they're brought to the house of Yosef. So he named it based on that verse in this week's Torah portion. In any case, Beis Yosef asks a famous question, which the question probably predates him, but it's still referred to as him because he famously asked this, and that was that there should not be 8 days of Chanukah. There should only be 7 days of Chanukah. Why should there only be 7 days of Chanukah? Because if we're commemorating the 8 days in which there was miraculous oil, so for that there's only 7 days of miraculous oil. There was enough oil that they found to last for 1 day, and it lasted for 8 days. So the miracle is not for a miracle of 8 days, it's a miracle of 7 days, because the first day was no miracle. It was natural. This is the famous question of the Beis Yosef. Why is there 8 days of Hanukkah? There should only be 7. And there are literally hundreds of various variations of answers to this question. One of the most famous ones is simply that there is a separate additional day for the miracle, which was not a supernatural miracle, but a natural miracle, and that was the victory, which itself was a miracle, but it was what we call a natural miracle. So also that's one of the explanations. But we're going to attempt to share with you a different type of an answer, of which I'm particularly fond. But that answer is dependent upon a different famous rabbinic question. And this famous rabbinic question is not as famous. Not only is it not as famous, it actually is somewhat controversial. Controversial not in that it raises anything that we would associate with controversy. It's controversial in the fact of we don't know whether or not it was truly asked by the person it's attributed to, and whether or not it's really a question. Was there really a basis to having such a question? What is this question that I want to share with you? And the question is that we know that on Chanukah they lit the menorah. They didn't have enough oil. They only found oil enough for one day. But the commandment to light that menorah is found in the Torah. The Torah commands us, and it says, it's supposed to be, it's shemen lamaor, and that shemen has to be olive oil. And the question that was raised in the name of Rabbi Chaim Soloveitchik, Rabbi Chaim Brisker, the famous Talmudic genius, supposedly asked that how is it that they were able to fulfill the mitzvah of lighting the menorah on the daily basis, which is a mitzvah every day in the temple to light the menorah every evening. Actually, I'll just mention that the Rambam almost inexplicably maintains that there is a mitzvah to light it in the morning as well, but that seems to go against the conclusions of the Talmud. But certainly once a day at least they had to light the menorah, but they were supposed to light it with olive oil, shemen zayis, the oil of zayis. Zayis is the Hebrew word for olive. It had to be olive oil. And this oil that miraculously lit the other nights seems to have been shemen nes. It's not olive oil. It's the oil of a miracle. It may have smelled like olive oil. It may have tasted like olive oil. It may have felt like olive oil, but it was not olive oil because olive oil comes from olives. This oil did not come from olives. It came through some miraculous methodology. Now, you could ask this question, and actually, if someone, I always think about this as the Star Trek question for all those Trekkies, and that is, those who are familiar with Star Trek will remember that in Star Trek there was a device which could change the molecular structure of any item into whatever it was that you wanted to. So you could put a cup of water into this device, and it would rearrange the atomic particles so that you will now have the molecules of an ice cream sundae. That was the idea behind that idea. All you had to do was take some matter. Once you had matter and you took the atoms, you could rearrange the atoms. So the question is that this question presumes that having the atomic and molecular structure of olive oil is not sufficient for it to be considered to be olive oil, but rather it needs to actually be oil that was pressed from olives. That's truly olive oil. Just because it looks like a duck and quacks like a duck doesn't make it into a duck, in halacha, according to this idea, this question. It needs to be actually pressed from actual olives. Therefore, the question was, how were they fulfilling the mitzvah on these 7 days of Chanukah, the 7 miraculous days of Chanukah, with what was something that was oil that was not pressed from an olive, but rather that was shemen nes. It came through a miracle. That was supposedly Reb Chaim Brisker's question. Now, the reason I say it's controversial is actually somebody, Tzvi Fishman, mentioned to me today that in Brisk, in Israel, there's a whole controversy whether or not they don't believe necessarily that Reb Chaim asked this question. I heard, and I see Rabbi Alt is smiling. I mean, I heard this question for Kolevsky, Zichrono Livracha.
Everyone says it over.
Everyone says it over like it's a question, but apparently it's a controversial. And there's a very good reason for why it's so controversial. And that is because there's a Gemara in Menachos, where a lot of these issues are discussed, which seems to indicate that it's not a problem at all. The Gemara talks about another type of miraculous case. Actually, it's not so clear if it's miraculous. The Gemara wants to know that, look at the wrong page. The Gemara wants to know, Reb Zera asked a question. Boy, Reb Zera, he asked a question. Chitin sheyardu ba'avim mahu. If you have wheat kernels that came down from the clouds, mahu, what's the halacha? What's the halacha on those wheat kernels? So the Gemara wants to know, well, wheat kernels for what? I mean, it depends what you're going to use them for. Lamai, for what purpose? Ila menachos, if it's for the purpose of the mincha, the meal offerings they would offer in the Beis HaMikdash in the temple, if it was going to be for those meal offerings, amai lo, what's the problem? So what, it came from the clouds. Ella, but rather, it's l'shtei halechem, it's from the 2 loaves of bread that were brought on Shavuos, 2 loaves of bread that were brought on the holiday of Shavuos. What is the halacha? Mi moshvo sechem amarachmana. Do we say that it has to come? The pasuk says, the verse tells us in the Torah that those 2 loaves have to come from your dwelling places, meaning to say from Eretz Yisrael, to exclude outside the land of Israel. Outside the land of Israel, you can't. That it won't work. But maybe that's only if it's outside of the land of Israel. But if it would be from the clouds, maybe that's considered okay. It's part of Israel or not. Or perhaps maybe it has to be from the land. So the question is, what's this question? What is this? These wheat kernels that came down through the clouds. So Rashi understands.
Rabbi Spetner, can I just interrupt you for 1 second?
Yeah, please. Yes.
A question came through in the chat. Someone would like to know what daf and menachos this Gemara is on.
This is on Samach Testament Beis, 69b.
Samach Testament Beis, perfect. Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
So Rashi there understands that this was not miraculous at all. You do have big winds, and sometimes we'll pick up things, especially if it's tornado-like winds, and plop them down in other places. And that's how it came down. It came from somewhere else. It came from Chutz La'aretz. It came, we're not sure, or we don't know where it came from. It's not 100% clear what the question exactly is according to Rashi, but it doesn't seem to be miraculous. Tosfos, however, disagrees with this for a number of different reasons. And he says that it was Tosfos says that it came miraculously. It's miracle. It's miracle. It's a miracle chitim. It's miracle seeds of wheat that have come down. That's what it's talking about. And the question is that okay or not? And Tosfos compares it to a Gemara in Sanhedrin where one of the Amoraim was attacked by a lion, and miraculously from heaven came down 2 big juicy steaks, and the lion said, I think I'll have the steaks instead of the human. So it was that type of miracle. So according to Tosfos, the way he understands this Gemara, so the Gemara, let's go through that Gemara again. The Gemara said, well, you have these wheat kernels that came miraculously from the clouds. What's the halacha? So we said, if it's for menachos, if it's for the regular menachos, why not? What's the problem? But rather, it must be for the 2 loaves which have to come from Eretz Yisrael. And so the question is that considered coming from Eretz Yisrael or not? Because this is a specific requirement. However, what you do seem to see from this Gemara is that even if it's miraculous, but when the Torah says the meal offerings are brought, they're brought from chitim, they have to be brought from wheat. But you see that the Gemara, according to Tosfos' understanding, understands that even miraculous wheat is still called wheat because it looks like wheat, it tastes like wheat, it has a molecular structure of wheat. It is wheat. Doesn't make a difference that it came from how it came from. So that's really that seems to point out that Reb Chaim Brisker could not have asked this question, because what's the matter with the olive oil? However, there really depends on 2 different ways of looking at this question, and that is, there's no question you see. Let me power up my battery here. You see, just want to make sure it's on. Okay, I'll lose you guys. You see that wheat, it's considered wheat, The question really is, when we use the words shemen zayis, is shemen zayis, olive oil, the equivalent of wheat, of the word wheat, and that this is molecularly shemen zayis, or do we say that shemen is what it is? It's oil. It has to come from zayis. In other words, is shemen zayis just purely in Hebrew, in the Torah's words, a descriptive term? And therefore, it's a descriptive term. So this meets that requirement. Just like the word chitim meets it's a miraculous chitim. As long as the molecular structure of chitim, it's chitim. And same thing with shemen zayis. It's shemen zayis. Or do you say no? It means it has to be shemen that comes from zayis, that it comes from an olive, and this didn't truly come from an olive. Is the Torah, by saying shemen zayis, requiring it come from a zayis, or they require just saying it should be shemen zayis? See, there's the difference between the two. Does it have to? Is it saying it has to come from actual zayis, or there has to have been historically in the process of this olive, this oil in front of me, that it actually once upon a time was inside an olive, or does it need to be what we call shemen zayis, which would be the equivalent of chitim? So it's possible that shemen zayis is different than chitim, and that this Gemara is saying that miraculous wheat is also wheat, but that doesn't mean that olive oil, meaning oil that comes from olives, it still doesn't meet that requirement. Okay, I just want to, I'm running out of time, but I just want to close by giving you a fantastic answer to both questions from one of the Ger Rebbes. One of the Ger Rebbes said, it's very interesting that the Gemara in Shabbos, when it describes to us the history and the miracle of Chanukah, the way it describes it is that they found a pach shemen, they found one cruse of oil that b'chosamo shel kohen gadol. It had the seal of the kohen gadol. And so, first of all, why was this cruse of oil seems to have been, the way the Gemara expresses it, is it had been put away, and especially it has the seal of the kohen gadol. Why did the high priest? Did every cruse of oil in the Beis Hamikdash? We never find anywhere that the Kohen Gadol signed off on every cruse of oil. Seems like an unusual thing. Says the Chedush, the Ger Rebbe like this. He says that what the Gemara is indicating to you is that this was no regular cruse of oil. What had happened was, many years before the story of Chanukah, they were once pouring oil into various pachim, into various jars, and there was a particular jar that as they poured into it, it kept on receiving more and more oil beyond its normal physical limitations. And 8 times the normal amount of oil went in to that cruse. 8 times the amount. And that's unusual. They took note of that and they sealed it with the seal of the Kohen Gadol. And they should remember that. And that's the one they found. This answers both questions, because it answers Reb Chaim's question, or supposed question, because it wasn't unusual oil. It was regular oil that came from olives. It just, the miracle was a miracle of space. And that is, it was able to contain, that cruse was able to contain 8 times the normal space of a regular cruse could contain. It also would explain that the miracle even happened on the first day, because even on the first day, the cruse was able to really, I mean, I shouldn't say it was on the first day. The point is that the miracle really indicates, is all about the number, that there were 8 days of oil within one cruse. That's really the miracle. The miracle is an 8-day miracle because 8 days were in there. Otherwise, you could ask the question that on the first day it's true, but on the last day it emptied. So there was no miracle on the last day. That's only if you express it as looking at each day. But if you look at the miracle as being the fact that 8 days of oil were in one cruse, that's the rationale for having an 8-day Chanukah memorial, because it contained within it those 8 days. And the other point, which I don't have time to get into, is that the idea of space being a cessation of space within the Beis Hamikdash is something that we find in a number of different places. We know that in Yerushalayim, nobody ever said that it's too crowded for me to sleep in Yerushalayim. In the Beis Hamikdash's courtyard, people were able to stand shoulder to shoulder. They actually lifted off their feet, and they were able to bow with plenty of room. And in the Kodesh HaKodashim, in the Holy of Holies, the Makom Aron Eina Min Amida, the space taken up by the Holy Ark itself took up no space whatsoever. There was a cessation of space. And there's a lot to say about this, but that's for another class. Everyone have a wonderful Shabbos.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Spetner.
My pleasure.
Have a wonderful
pleasure.
Shabbos. And
thank you very much.
Chanukah.
Chanukah to everybody. Thank you for joining. I very much appreciate your all coming.
Thank you.
Take care. Have a good Shabbos. Bye-bye.